The nation will fall silent at 11 o'clock today, remembering all those who made the ultimate sacrifice in service of this country. Her Majesty the Queen will be at the Cenotaph to lead the National Remembrance Day service. It'll be particularly poignant for General Sir Nick Carter, the Chief of the Defence Staff, who will soon retire from that role and from the British Army, which he joined back in 1977. There's been no shortage of major issues for him to contend with in the last few years, and when I spoke to him at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, I started by asking about the most pressing, Afghanistan, and how he felt about the chaotic withdrawal of Western troops.
It was tough. It wasn't the outcome that any of us wanted. And we hoped right up until the end that the Afghan government and its armed forces would be able to hang in there and create the sort of circumstances in which you could get a proper political reconciliation. So for all of us, it was tough. And of course, for those who fought in Afghanistan against the Taliban, who now are in power, that was particularly difficult because, of course, they were the enemy at the time.
It must take a lot for soldiers now, having fought in the way that they did, you did, in Afghanistan, to have to talk to the Taliban. Is that what we have to do now?
We certainly have to engage them for a number of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, there are still Afghans who worked with us who we are worried will be the subject of vendettas, and we would like to see them find a way out of Afghanistan, and we would like to look after them to achieve that. Secondly, we're very worried about the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, and that's been in the media this week. And in order to resolve that, one has to engage with the Taliban government to try and make sure the money gets to where it needs to get to. And then I think also we need to engage with them to get them to understand that they need to govern inclusively. Because many of the gains that we made in the 20 years that we were engaged there, we could lose if they don't govern inclusively. And the rights of women, the opportunity for girls to go to school, and the rights of all minorities in Afghanistan need to be properly respected. And if that doesn't happen, then the answer is that we will have failed.
It must be a bitter pill to swallow, though, for not you, but someone like you, to have to sit down opposite both people that you fought against and also people that, frankly, in what they want to do, what they did before when they were in government, feels abhorrent.
Yes, but I think we've all been around long enough to know that wars generally end in a conversation, and they generally end with a compromise. Now, if Afghanistan turns out in 5 years' time to be a country that is being governed inclusively, in which the rights of all of its people are properly respected, then I think we can look back on our intervention in Afghanistan with some satisfaction. There's a big if at the front end of that. And if that means that we have to talk to people that we originally regarded as the enemy, then so be it. It's tough to do, but let's face it, that's how we achieve peace in Northern Ireland.
Before they came into government this time, the Taliban said, we're different. Do you really believe that?
I think they have definitely done some things already that are different. I mean, the fact that the media is still being allowed to operate and to report relatively honestly in Afghanistan is a good indicator. It is still the case that women are not in the government and are not going to secondary education, but they are going to primary education, and that is different to what they did in the past. So there are things that are going on in Afghanistan which are definitely different to what they were 20 years ago. And that, I think, is because this Taliban government, should we call it Taliban 2 rather than Taliban 1, they recognise that 60% of Afghans have been born since 2001. And that's a very large proportion of the population who've seen a slightly different country to the one that predated 2001. And the Taliban, at the end of the day, know that they have got to take people with them if they're going to govern effectively. They can't govern completely brutally. That just won't work in the modern environment. Because the thing that's really changed is social media and modern media. And they can't put that back in the box.
Are you in favour of the kind of inquiry, perhaps a public inquiry, into the Afghanistan exercise?
Well, I think we need to be clear that I think, unlike Iraq, nobody, I think, was in any doubt that the reason for entering Afghanistan in the first place was just. There was a unanimous Security Council resolution. Indeed, Article 5 of the NATO treaty was placed on the table. So I don't think anybody's in any doubt that it was a just war. I think there are some big questions that need to be answered about how the war was conducted thereafter. And those are lessons that both policymakers and military figures, and for that matter, more broadly, the development community need to learn. Whether the right way of achieving that is through a public inquiry or not, I don't know, because I don't think this is about apportioning blame or anything like that. This is about making sure that we all learn from the experience so that next time we have to do something like this, we do it better than we did this time.
You said that you could imagine Afghanistan being a tourist destination. Really?
Well, what I was trying to say is that in the great swathe of history, nobody would have thought in the late 1970s that Vietnam would ever be a place that Westerners would go on holiday. 50 years downstream, Vietnam is an extraordinarily successful country. The point I'm trying to make is give everything time.
Are we in danger of entering a new Cold War with China?
No, I don't think we are. And indeed, I don't think that's the right direction to travel. Now, I think everybody recognises that this century is going to be the Asian century and that China is going to be at the heart of that, and that there are going to be many areas where we need to work with China and indeed engage with China and trade with China, because that's where the economic value is going to come from. I think we will also observe that there are things that China does which we don't approve of. China's human rights record, the way it's behaving with the Uyghurs and with Hong Kong, are things that we will absolutely call them out on.
What could we possibly do to defend Taiwan?
There's some big questions there about whether it's our task to defend Taiwan. And that's not something that I'm going to opine on, because these are political judgments. I think what I would say as a military officer is that ultimately we want to make sure that we don't go to war over issues like that, because that would not be in anybody's interests.
And your advice is it would be plausible for the military in whatever configuration to defend Taiwan against Chinese aggression?
The answer is that I have not considered it yet. And I think my military advice is always going to be to try and avoid going to war.
The former MI6 officer, Christopher Steele, told Sky News that Russian leaders believe that they're at war with the UK and its allies. That makes sense to you? Do you agree with that?
Well, I think that Russia probably regards the global strategic context as a continuous struggle in which I think they would apply all of the instruments of national power to achieve their objectives, but in so doing don't want to bring on a hot war. So yes, I think in a way he's right. The question, of course, is how you define war. And I would tend, as a soldier, to define war as the actual act of combat and fighting. And I think they don't want to do that. I think they want to try and achieve their objectives in rather more nuanced ways.
Let's talk about the armed services that you are leaving behind as you retire. Are they fit for purpose?
Point, I guess, is what you think their purpose is. And if you believe that we're here to deter war from happening, then my judgment is that our armed forces are very much fit for deterring our enemies. Of course, one has to remember that we do this in an alliance. We do it in NATO. NATO is the bedrock of our security, and fundamentally we see our security being delivered through that European relationship at the heart of NATO. And the answer is that we are very much leaders within NATO. And I'm pretty confident that we're well prepared to do what we have to do as part of that NATO alliance.
The Secretary of State complains that women are still unlikely to get to the most senior roles in the armed services. Do you agree? And if so, I suppose he would be saying this is a failure on the part of you and your colleagues.
Yes, the facts are clear. We do not have enough women at the top of the armed forces. We have more than we did have, but we don't have enough. And there's a reason for that. And that is because the armed forces are a bottom-fed organisation. And if you think back a few years, it was only in 2016 when I, as the Chief of the General Staff, took the decision to open all roles up to women in the army, including the combat roles. And up until that point, 60% of the roles in the army were available to women, but not all of them. So it was difficult, of course, for women to rise up through the ranks in order to be able to get to the highest possible ranks. I think we've done a lot to try and adjust the career structure as well, because the career structure is one that, frankly, was designed for men. And we've had to change that, and we are changing it, to make it easier for women, if they wish to raise families, to take time out to do that, and then to be promoted based upon their potential, rather than what they do during their 30s, as that's the sort of typical age that we're talking about. But fundamentally, it's also about culture. And what we have to do is to create a culture in the armed forces which looks to maximise everybody's talent. and not to be exclusive in the way it does it.
The nature of warfare is changing. I mean, is laddishness necessarily part of modern warfare? One might equally argue geekishness is part of modern warfare.
When I talk about, there's a difference between the nature of war, which is a political act. It's about combat, it's about fighting, and it's about human interaction in a violent way. The character of warfare is different, and that's where you bring in geekiness, cyber, and all these other things. I still believe that it will be necessary for soldiers in the final analysis to have to go close and personal with each other in order to achieve an outcome if you are fighting a genuine war. And that is the nature of war. So the answer is that it will still be necessary to have people who are prepared to do that.
A tenfold increase in reports of rape by teenagers in the armed forces, which you've yourself said are truly shocking. If we keep that idea that we have to have these warriors, this type of warriors, is it a consequence of that we're going to have to live with that kind of, I don't want to even call it behaviour?
No, we're absolutely not going to live with that sort of behaviour, because what we're going to do is to make sure that our values and standards, which are well understood, are properly enforced. And we're absolutely going to make sure that the leaders in the armed forces understand those values and standards and recognise that it is their task, on the one hand, to make sure that we are capable of fighting if we have to fight, but on the other hand, that we're capable of building inclusive teams in which everybody feels respected, a key value, and in which everybody feels that through being included, they are able to contribute to our ultimate purpose. And that is why the stories that we're hearing at the moment in the media, and which are being properly investigated, are shocking, because they are genuinely, I suspect, a failure of leadership. And they need to acknowledge that it is perfectly respectable on the one hand to be able to fight, but on the other hand, you need to do it in a sensible and civilised way. And that matters on the battlefield as well. Because if we lose sight of our values and standards on the battlefield, and if we lose sight of the importance of the rules of war, then we will lose the moral high ground in relation to our opponents. And that's pretty fundamental as well.
We've seen in recent days allegations, and in fact they're pretty well founded, of the behaviour of troops in Kenya. It's a scandal, really, isn't it?
The allegations are truly shocking, and it's absolutely vital that we get to the bottom of them as quickly as possible, and that those who are guilty, if they are guilty of those allegations, are brought to trial. And we're going to cooperate very closely with the Kenyan authorities to make sure that that is resolved as quickly as it possibly can be.
There is a sense that the behaviour of some of our service people, particularly men, is such that they seem to think that actually, because they play this incredibly important role, they're allowed to do all sorts of other things. And that has both, that brings the army and the other services into disrepute. It also, by the way, I imagine, discourages women from joining and wanting to stay in the armed forces. This is all bad.
The bottom line is that you cannot have the sort of culture that leads to this sort of behaviour and these sort of allegations. No, it's fundamentally disgraceful, and in no way can the armed forces be happy if that occurs. It will be a deterrent to all sorts of things that we espouse, and we must get to the bottom of it.